Science is not a boy's game. It's not a girl's game. It's everyone's game. It's about where we are and where we're going. Michelle Nichols. It's time for science, and it's time to talk about equity in science education with Claudio Vargas and Holly Gill. Claudio Vargas, a science education consultant with a focus on equity in STEM, works with Sci-Lingual Education and FOSS at the Lawrence Hall of Science. We talk with Mr. Vargas about working on the committee that issued the national call to action about equity in science education, how the pandemic affected education and science, the importance of a rigorous curriculum with an emphasis on active learning, and being aware of our own biases. Holly Gill, an instructional specialist, science education ELD consultant, has trained and mentored hundreds of teachers in the Santa Barbara area. We chat about supporting teachers as they work to overcome their fears of teaching science and the difficulties in working to implement an equitable classroom, the linguistic challenges inherent in the NGSS, and how students' excitement can keep them motivated. Well, it's time for science, and it's time to talk about equity in science education, and we have the perfect guest for this. Claudio Vargas is here to talk about this vitally important subject. Claudio is an educational consultant supporting language development in science, but most importantly is Claudio served as a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee, which issued the national call to action to advance equitable science education. So basically, one of the main reasons it's happening is because of you and this group. So I'd like to find out more about that. How did that come about, and what led to the national call to action for this specific thing?
Well, about 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, good afternoon or good morning first to everybody.
Good morning.
I'm happy to be here. And yes, so I was part of a consensus study that was put together by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics in 2020-21, that was looking at what was going on in the country during the pandemic and the status of science in the country, nationally, in the world, and especially in the educational system. So the National Academy put together a committee of 10 members from across the country, and I was selected as one of those members, which was a great opportunity for me because that's my field of study. And we spent about 6 months looking at the status of science education in the country. And we came up with a vision of what we wanted science to look like. And if I may read that vision, it's easier than memorizing them.
Of course.
And it says, our vision is that every student experiences the joy, beauty, and power of science, learns how science can be used to solve local and global problems, sees the pathways they can take into science-related careers, and feels welcome and valued in science classrooms. That last part is the most important for me, that every child feels valued and welcome in the science classroom. And that doesn't always happen for a variety of reasons. So to start this work, we had to first think about what is science and what is the value of science in society. And we came up with 3 or 4 ways or approaches to look at science. One is that science is a way to understand the world. And science helps us participate in decision-making that's based on evidence, not an opinion. And what we saw is that a lot of what was going on in this country is that people had different political views and opinions that were getting in the way of really looking at what was going on in the country in the middle of the pandemic around vaccination, around mask wearing, etc. So science has to be evidence-based, and it will help us deal with problems in this world. The other thing we saw is that science is culturally determined, just like education, right? It's a cultural endeavor. It's not just imparting information, but that information is based on your perception of the world, on who does science, what are the role models of science, what is science, right? So we had to look at how to bring science into the educational system with the perspective of equity, allowing everybody access to this educational system. And we also saw that science is a great context for literacy and language development. So that's one. So science is a way to look at the world and to be able to participate in society based on our evidence-based decision-making. Second, science is a way to solve problems in the world. We have climate change, we have problems with nutrition, transportation, energy, and science can help us solve problems. But in order to solve all the problems that exist and not just problems of those that are in power, we need a diverse working force that can tackle all the questions that affect everybody. So we need a diverse workforce. And we know that in the STEM educational field, that doesn't exist. Alaskan Natives, Latin, Native Americans, and African Americans constitute about 30% of the population in this country, but are only represented at 10% in the science and engineering fields. So there's a discrepancy there. So in other words, in order to solve the problems of the world, we need diverse voices talking about those problems. And the third way to look at science, it's a road to meaningful work. It's a great paying job, right? It's creative and it deals with innovation. And the STEM field has increased by about 80% in the last few years. And somebody working in that field makes about 50,000 more than in other fields. So we have to provide opportunities for our students, if they want, to go into the fields of STEM. So that's where we started this road down to understanding what was going on in the science in this country and in the educational system.
Bringing it down to a teacher level, especially for an elementary teacher, what kind of things can they do to increase equity in their classrooms or in their districts? What kind of actual things can they be doing in their own schools?
Well, there's definitely a gap in the educational system in terms of our students, right? We have a diverse student in California, for example. Over 60% are what we would call minority students, African American nation, Latin, and other groups of people that are not white. So when we look at things like the CAS, the science test, we see a huge discrepancy in how students are performing. So how can we help that? How can we help teachers help students? That's your question, right? The first one is providing opportunities for every child to learn science. So in other words, equalizing opportunities to learn. At this point in time, students in California, well, it was actually a couple of years before the pandemic, they did a study and they found that about 22% of K-2 students receive no science instruction in California. 22%. So those students don't have the opportunities to make decisions in terms of if they like following a science field or not. In the country, it's a little better overall. Students get about 20 minutes of science a week in the K-5, which is what you ask. In contrast, they get 90 minutes of ELA a day and 60 minutes of math a day. So there's a big-ish discrepancy there in terms of the educational system in science. So we have to provide more opportunities to learn, right? We have to teach more science. That's one. The second is to have a curriculum that's a rigorous curriculum in science. And there's a few out there. My experience is mostly with FOSS. I've been using FOSS since I started teaching in 1994. And I taught it in K through 5, and then the last 20 years or so, I've been working with teachers using also FOSS. And that is definitely a rigorous curriculum. But any curriculum that's used has to involve students in active learning or practices of science. If they are not involved in doing science, they will not be learning science. Looking at videos, reading about science is a second-hand, somebody else's experience. We need our students to have that experience. And every student is capable of making meaning of those experiences when they work with others and when they're scaffolded as needed. But it's not enough to have more science instruction and a rigorous curriculum if it's not an inclusive teaching. What do I mean by that? One is where all students, just like the vision said, feel welcome and valued. That means that our teachers and our systems have to have a look at our students in a way that ensures that they have high expectations. So having high expectations for our students is critical. And the issue there, that while every teacher can learn how to do that, can be aware of that need, they need to be aware of the biases, implicit biases that exist. In California, for example, we have about 60% of students that are Latino, 56 to be exact. 20% of our teachers are Latino or Latina, versus the other way around. There's 20% white students in California, and over 70% of teachers are white. So there's also a discrepancy there that's not insurmountable. It's the reality. But it means that we have to support our teachers to be able to work with students from cultures that are not their culture. We can do that, and we have to do that. Right? So those three things, I think, are critical. One, more science, better science, more equitable science, high quality, rigorous curriculum, and an inclusive teaching, right? Inclusive practices of teaching.
How is that, especially that last one? How do teachers get that? Are there resources out there, or people like you go to classes or to groups or schools or districts and talk about this?
Yes and yes. There are resources. There's a lot of curriculum that focuses on cultural and linguistic relevant pedagogies. And that is a way to be able to be inclusive by looking at where students are coming from, right? Being open to students' prior knowledge, right? Their family and their funds of knowledge that they bring from their communities, and include that in the teaching and the instruction. Right? So when you make science relevant to our students, when you make the phenomena, there's a lot of talk about phenomena, right? When you make phenomena relevant to students from different communities, then you're able to engage and motivate the teaching and the learning. The thing about curriculum, yes, maybe this is an aside, curriculum such as FOSS or any science curriculum is made for the nation, right? It's not made for one teacher's students. So while I I don't think that curriculum development is what teachers should be doing. I think that's not their area of expertise. Their area of expertise is teaching a curriculum, a high quality curriculum, to their own students and taking what that curriculum provides and making it theirs. And so students can be engaged and can relate to what is being taught. So that's definitely very important. The other part is to know your students. It's really critical to know your students, who they are, where they come from, the culture, the language. And it's not an easy task, definitely, but it's so critical that teachers get to be part of that community, right? And understand where their students are coming from and build on students' prior interest, build on their identity, and leverage those cultural funds of knowledge, what they bring. And the interesting thing about science is that we think science is very objective, right? There's only one science in the world, and that is a middle class, white approach, Western approach to teaching, which is not universal. So we have to be open to other ways of looking at the world. A good example is Western science tends to look at the world, say, at biology, and classify things and separate in little groups and sort them and separate them into little tiny groups and name each of those groups. Other cultures don't do that. They look at biology, they look at the world around them and see relationships, right? Which is very different than separate things into little chunks. So there's different views of the world, and we have to be open as educators, have to be open to our students and our families' perspectives.
I think the discussion has also come up of science kind of gets pushed to the side because they want to emphasize on math and English and things like that. And some people have this attitude that if they're not native speakers, they would have trouble with science. But the argument is that it actually, science gives them more vocabulary. It allows them to think of things and have to express themselves, and that it's actually a very big part of literacy. How would you say, if somebody came to you and said, oh, we don't need science because it doesn't affect literacy, how would you respond to that?
That's a great point there, Tom. There is this notion that you can't have students in the science classroom until they know the language of instruction. And they forget, or they don't know, or realize that science creates the context for language development. It's the perfect context. One, every child that goes into that science classroom has prior knowledge of science because they are part of the world. They're interacting with the world. They're curious about the world. Second, inquiry science, hands-on science. Science where you practice the practices of science and engineering taps into that natural curiosity because students are doing science. They're not just reading about science or looking at a video. So that natural curiosity, which I believe is the mother of engagement, right? And we know that if students are not engaged, they will not learn. It promotes language use, just like you mentioned before. Science is a collaborative endeavor. You have to work, if you're teaching it in the correct way, you teach it in groups, collaborative groups. You have your students experience the doing of science together and talk about what they're doing. And in this process, you're doing multiple forms of language use. Students are using different registers. By that I mean they come in to the science classroom with their home language use, their outside recess language use, and our job as teachers, educators, is to bridge the home language to the language of the discipline. And I'm not talking about academic language, because who determines what academic is? It's the language of the disciplines. And there's different modalities. Science has so many modalities. There's graphing, there's modeling, there's drawing, there's tables, and there's talking in groups, there's talking in pairs, there's talking whole groups. And that it's such a rich context for language development that when they leave, they are much more cognizant not only of vocabulary, but also of how to communicate that vocabulary. So yes, I think it's a travesty to keep students away from science till they learn the language of instruction, because the language of instruction will be learned invisibly in the background as students want to communicate, get excited, want to communicate what they know, right, with others.
I love that. That's a common theme, getting the kids excited, because science is one of those things that really motivates kids to want to learn. It's a constant discovery, and I think kids love that.
One thing we do have to remember, kids can be very excited and engaged in the doing of science, but the reality is we don't learn from our experience, but we learn from making sense of that experience. So students can be engaged through the activities, but at some point, you need to have students think about why what is happening is happening. In other words, answering that focus question that explains the phenomena they're engaged in. And a curriculum has to really focus on discourse, on writing, and on reading. But after students have that experience, after they become motivated, engaged, then they have to start making sense, right? And we can't leave it to the last 2 minutes before recess to do that, right? Science, I get very excited about science because it's not only curiosity, but really learning so much about how to look at the world, how to interact with other kids, right? How to understand and make decisions based on evidence, as I mentioned earlier, around this country. So they can, at some point in the future, or even now, participate in decision making at their school, in their community, and later in the world as a whole.
I think I want to wrap up with the question of, what are your personal aspirations in this field? What do you want to do next? Obviously, as one of the driving people behind this, the committee that called for this for action, things like that. So you're in a real position of influence and power. What are your aspirations? What do you want to see happen next?
Well, there were many recommendations, 8 recommendations from this committee in 3 big action areas. Action area 1 was to elevate the status of science in this country. And this goes across the board, from the White House leadership, from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, what's called the OSTP. That was one area that for action, but it has to go all the way to the districts and the schools and the classrooms, where science takes on the same status as language arts and math and any core curriculum. To provide more opportunities for more equitable science by looking at what's going on in schools, in the region, in the state, and in the country. And one of the action areas from the call to action was to have what's called a STEM opportunity map, to look at what was going on in the STEM fields and look at real data of what what districts are doing to support students in these fields. Just bring science to the foreground again, and see that when you talk about literacy, about reading, writing, speaking, and listening, ELA is not a content area. It depends on content. And science is a great content to develop those skills. So the more students are involved and engaged and motivated to learn, the more they will use those skills and develop those skills. So basically bring science again to the forefront and give the students the opportunity to learn. And in that learning of content, they're also learning the language of instruction. So that's my goal, and to really incentivize teachers. And my experience is if you go out there and work with teachers and model what I'm saying, model a good science lesson, they too will get excited, because the more excited teachers are, the more students will learn.
That sums it up beautifully. I think that's fantastic. Claudio, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly enlightening and very, very helpful. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, it's time for science, and it's time to talk about equity and inclusion. Holly Gill from Adelante Charter School of Santa Barbara is here to talk about this important concept with us, and you are the expert. I'm talking to you off the air, and I'm like, okay, you're the perfect person to talk to about this. So could you tell me what your title is and exactly what you do for the school you work at?
I am an instructional specialist at Adelante Charter School. It's a K-6 dual immersion school, and I support curriculum and instruction all throughout. And I also serve as a consultant to different districts in science education and English language development.
You worked in the Santa Barbara Public Schools for a number of years?
Yes, I was with Santa Barbara Unified for about 13 years, supporting 9 different elementary schools.
So how does your work, let's start off with the big concept, how does your work support equity, access, and inclusion in science specifically?
Well, when I started with Santa Barbara Unified, there was very little science being taught. And it was essentially just pockets of science. These science champions, as we called it, were teaching science. And there really was no emphasis on science other than maybe a 5th grade teacher, because there was a 5th grade science test. And so particularly in the Title I schools, it was even explicitly said that they didn't have to worry about science.
Really?
And so the assistant superintendent at the time had known me from, I had worked with her previously, and she asked if I could come in and help to support the work that they were trying to do around science for elementary teachers. And my background was teaching middle school. And so I started that work with another colleague, Bridget Lewin, and we did that for about 12, 13 years. And it was really starting at the ground zero, essentially. And that was right before NGSS had come in and all of those changes. But really our vision, my vision in particular, was I wanted to see access to science education for all students, and particularly students from my neighborhood, and I live on the Lower East Side of Santa Barbara. It's predominantly Latino community, low-income community, and those students were not receiving science education. And we know that if they're not exposed to that in elementary school, the chances of being successful in high school, junior high and high school, in science classes is not very promising.
You really got to get them young to get them excited about the concept, for sure. Yeah,
right.
It must have been kind of nice though, coming in from when there's nothing. Then you can shape it the way you want to. I mean, it was basically you got to build it from the ground up. That's awesome.
Right, except that there was a lot of resistance to that, and I think always. Something that all districts encounter, where I would say that most of the elementary teachers don't have a background in science, and so they're kind of tentative around science, and even some are fearful around science. So it was a lot of supporting them to feel confident in teaching science. And something that was interesting when we first started doing this work was we surveyed teachers and had them kind of map out their experiences in science in school and out of school when they were growing up, and like through their lifetime. And so many of them had really negative experiences related to science within school. And so it's no wonder that they weren't teaching a lot of science.
Oh, once again, a constant reminder of how important teachers are to us in our lives.
Right.
Whether they're good or bad, it can change your entire life. So I think that's awesome. I mean, we've obviously touched on this, but the next big question is, why is this an important focus? Why do you think having science, if the districts are like, yeah, it's not that important, why do you think it is?
Well, I think it's critical to creating a future of thinkers and innovators and change makers. I think if we're not informed as citizens, we run into all kinds of problems that we're seeing now in our communities. And for students, especially those that are most historically marginalized, to be left out of science learning and these conversations, it's going to have implications in our future. But also, I know that kids love science. Kids are naturally curious, and these students are bringing their own experiences and backgrounds to science, and they're able to enrich the experience for everyone in the classroom. And I remember when we first started working with teachers, it was something that really bothered me is they would start teaching science, and it wasn't just the hands-on science, but the speaking about science and doing science and writing about science. And I would have teachers come up to me and, oh, you wouldn't believe this, and they would talk about their lowest EL student was the one that figured out the problem first, or that they were able to uncover what was going on first, and they were so shocked by this. And it was difficult for me because I felt like it uncovered so much of the deficit thinking that existed within the school district about these students. And but yet it was encouraging to me because this was an opportunity for them to show their genius and highlight that. And so for me, it's been an area that I continue to advocate for, and then we also see this as an opportunity to develop language, and that coupled with the science, where they're learning science content along with learning English, is just amazing, and we're seeing really promising results because of that.
I know I've said often on this podcast, I come from an art background, and the more I do this, the more I see the correlation between science and art, especially for kids. They're both the most exciting subjects for kids. I mean, they're just their exploration and their creativity, and it's wonderful. I think it's great that this is such an important part of it. So what aspects of your equity work do you think are the most effective? How can people be effective with getting equity in science in the schools?
I think that you have to have a commitment to do this. It's going to be difficult and there's resistance, but I think pushing through and supporting teachers, I think ultimately teachers need to be supported. And like I said, there was a lot of fear within the teachers just around teaching science, and then also these deficit perspectives and mindsets that maybe these kids can't do this, or we need to spend more time on ELA, or they need to learn English before they can do this. How could they possibly read the science text? So supporting teachers to see that it is possible to give these opportunities to all students and to support students to be successful with that. But it takes time. It takes investment in the teachers.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, like you said, overcoming the resistance. I think that's, it seems like it's one of those things where we're talking about it like it's obvious, but it obviously isn't. It's people are going to resist this kind of thing. So fighting through that and having the support.
Right. Teachers have so much that they need to do, and so much that they need to cover, and then the pressure on them to get reading scores up, to get math scores up. It's easy to push science aside, and that's what's happened for so many years. And I feel like that we have that danger creeping back right now, and that's alarming. I feel like we've made some grounds in science education, and now we're seeing it kind of backtrack a little bit.
One step forward, two steps back kind of situation. Mm-hmm. We don't want that. What would you consider your aspirations in this field? What would you like to do and expand, and how do you want to grow in this field?
Well, I think one area that I was able to participate in was developing designated ELD lessons along with the FOSS science lessons. I supported a team or worked with a team. They did the majority of the work, but that has been really exciting to see. And then now teachers are using those materials and getting students to talk about science, getting students to bring their full selves to the classroom experience and share those experiences, and improve their reading and their speaking abilities, listening abilities, all of those. That's really exciting to me to see that. So I also think addressing some of these more social justice issues in science, the issues that kids really care about and that they are experiencing at home, I think is really important. And I think bringing in different perspectives to science education. I'm not doing this in science education so that everyone becomes a scientist. It's really, it's just information that everyone needs to know and everyone needs. But the more of these most, historically marginalized communities that are experiencing science, that get into science and inform the way we think about things, it's just, the better it's going to make it for all of us. And so it's exciting to me when I see that, when I see kids who went through elementary school when I was starting out, now they're in college, and they're not afraid to pursue STEM majors, or they feel like they have a place in those classrooms, and that's really difficult, especially when you get into secondary. It's really divided, and you can be the lone brown student in a classroom, and it's really hard for them. And so I think seeing that change, seeing the fruits of the labor in elementary school, supporting students so that they can be successful into secondary, is really important, and that's been difficult.
What would you advise educators, leaders, or other stakeholders to do if they want this in their school, to find someone like you? How do they go about creating equity in their systems?
Well, I think right now what Santa Barbara is doing, and what we do at Adelante as well, is we've attached the science to the designated ELD time. And I mean, integrated ELD should be happening all the time in all content areas. But now that we have science connected to the designated ELD is mandated. There's mandated time for that. And in order to do the designated ELD, they have to also teach the science because they need that context. And so that's keeping the science going because they need to have it for the designated ELD. So I think that having leaders that aren't afraid to say, we are committed to this, we are going to invest time in this, and that aren't afraid that if we spend time in science, it's going to jeopardize our reading scores, or that somehow they're going to jeopardize their math time or something like that, but that it actually can help to support their reading scores, and it's building knowledge and building background and vocabulary and all of that. And that teachers need to be supported to see that as well. But again, I think it's a commitment on the part of the district leaders, the principals, and then that there is support for the teachers.
We know there are a lot of challenges, linguistic challenges with the NGSS. I know that you teach in a Spanish-speaking school, and you've taught English-speaking schools. How important are these linguistic challenges? How do people overcome them?
Yes, it's definitely true that the NGSS has these challenges linguistically for students, and but it's also this incredible opportunity to develop language. And I think that as teachers implement these practices, like arguing from evidence, supporting students to argue from evidence, giving them sentence frames and scenarios and opportunities to talk, and even if it's imperfect English, that students are able to go back and forth. Or maybe they're using their primary language and arguing from evidence and then sharing out, and they're able to do that then in English. It just allows for this opportunity for students to make sense of what they're seeing and what they're experiencing and attaching language to that and then developing language. Something that I've encountered with teachers is this idea that, well, students have to learn more language, English language, before they could ever do that. But what we found is that no, students can actually do this. And when we support them with that language of argumentation or explanation or questioning, they are able to take that and then apply the learning that they have done in science. And they're able to communicate around that. And then they start to apply it in other areas as well.
I think that's great. That's perfect. I don't think I have anything to add to that. So that's wonderful. Because I mean, from a personal perspective, it would seem to me, I mean, even just learning a foreign language where you do it like the classic old school way, where it's like, you read this, blah, blah, blah. There's no, but if you're trying to explain yourself, if you're trying to get a concept across, like even if you're trying to order something in a foreign cafe, you're going to try harder, you're going to learn more. And I would think that that's totally the argument there, is that they're interested in this, so they want to get the point across.
Right. I remember I was teaching, I was co-teaching in a third grade classroom, and it was mostly multilingual students. And we were having a sense-making discussion. It was third graders, and they were learning about how when water is cold, it takes up less space than when it's warmer. And so they had done these investigations, and so we were talking about this, and the student who in imperfect English was explaining how, oh, now I see why my dad always wants to go fill up the gas tank early in the morning when it's cold. And he doesn't go in the afternoon. And when I heard him, I was like, what is he talking about? And then I realized he understands this concept so well. He's attaching it to this. And I don't know, maybe his dad really does go early in the morning because he is able to fill up more gas early when it's freezing cold. But where he was able to not only understand what we were doing and talk about it, but then connect it to something in his life. And when you can transfer what you've learned to something else in your experience, you really have learned that. And so that was really exciting.
That's great. Yeah, especially science. I think when kids realize science affects their daily life, it's not just this thing you're reading about. It's like it's literally all around you all the time. That's exciting, I think.
Right.
So, yeah. I think to wrap up, in general, as we've said a few times in this, is teachers may be reticent or afraid to teach science. What would you personally tell a teacher who came up to you like, look, I really want to do this, but I'm just not sure of myself? What kind of pep talk advice do you give elementary teachers about teaching science?
Well, I think they just need to start it. And oftentimes their own fears will cause them to come up with excuses. I don't have time. There's too many materials. I need somebody in here to help me. Can you model this lesson for me? I want to see somebody else do it. All of these things. And it just gets to the point where you just need to try it. And most often what happens is if teachers start to teach science consistently, not just a one-off, maybe once every 2 weeks they do something, but a consistent teaching of science, then the kids are so excited about it, and they'll come in every day. Are we doing science today? Are we doing science today? Is it science? And that motivates the teachers because they want to do these things with the kids, and they know that the kids enjoy it so much and that they're learning and bringing in their own experiences as well. And so I think it really does come from the students, and that motivates them. And so I think that they need time. They need time for planning. They need time to collaborate. They need time for professional learning, but it is all possible.
Are there any resources out there that you would suggest people look for if they really wanted some help? Are there any places you would suggest a teacher go for information about this or help?
Well, in our district, we're using the FOSS curriculum. And that I feel like the FOSS curriculum is highly supportive, and it comes with videos, all the materials, everything that teachers can plan ahead, and then starting with we just start with the basic, let's teach the lesson, then we'll move on to the assessment part and really getting into the sense-making discussions, and all of that takes time and really refining your practice. But I think having supportive curriculum is essential, especially if you don't have a science background. And I do feel like there's great curriculum out there to support teachers, but also having administrators that are supportive of this as well.
Well, Holly, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. This is such an important aspect of this whole of science and general education. I'm really thank you for your insights.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Hi there, producer David Lippman here. I've been honestly way too busy to try out any new games lately, so I thought I'd talk about a book this time. I absolutely love the work of writer-illustrator Rachel Ignatowski. Honestly, every book I've seen of hers is striking. Her ability to organize information in visually stunning and compelling ways through her amazing illustrations is one thing, but coupled with her engaging writing style, just really great, relevant stuff that will resonate with readers of all ages. One of my favorite books of hers is Women in Science, 50 Fearless Pioneers Who Changed the World. This book is organized in 2-page spreads that visit the lives of 50 women in science. From Hypatia and Marie Curie to Patricia Bath and Rosalind Franklin, each spread has a beautiful portrait surrounded by tidbits of information on the woman's life, along with a brief outline of their life and accomplishments. Oh, and I'm just always a sucker for little illustrations and margins. They just bring each piece to life. Some additional spreads on lab tools, for example, round out this already fantastic book. And Ms. Ignatowski's fantastic Statistics and STEM spread will make it easy for you to talk with your students about how women are represented in STEM with some great visuals. Published by the folks at 10 Speed Press, this book is recommended for grades 5 and up. I'd argue that you could definitely consider using with younger kids. They might need some help with the text at times, but the illustrations will make this an interesting piece for a wide range of students. Moving on, we'd like to close this episode out by wishing a happy December birthday to Dr. Patricia S. Cowings. The first American woman to be trained as a scientist astronaut by NASA, Dr. Cowings, a psychophysiologist, pioneers and continues to work on physiological training systems designed to help astronauts with space and motion sickness. I don't have the time to do Dr. Cowings' illustrious career justice, but I strongly recommend that you encourage interested students to research more about her contributions and work. Happy birthday, Dr. Cowings. As always, thank you for listening to It's Time for Science.
It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lippman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the full option science system, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS over on Facebook and Twitter.